When a man loses everything that truly matters in life, sometimes all he has left is hope and stubborn pride. In the dusty frontier town of Ciena Notreal, 58-year-old widower Jed Tully had become the laughingstock of every local saloon after trading his last horse for a weather-beaten safe nobody could open. The retired cattleman was chasing ghosts, they whispered behind his back. Lost his mind completely since his beloved wife passed away last year. But Jed believed this mysterious vault once belonged to a notorious outlaw who had hidden something far more valuable than gold deep inside its rusted walls. What could possibly drive a grieving man to stake everything on a box of secrets? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've personally saved something truly extra special for all of you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of Jed Tully's ranch house, painting the landscape in hues of amber and rust that reminded him too much of Martha's hair when the light caught it just right. He sat in the same wooden chair where they'd shared countless evenings watching the sunset paint the sky, her hand warm in his, planning futures that would never come to pass. Now the chair beside him remained empty, gathering dust like so many other things since she'd been laid to rest in the cemetery overlooking the valley they'd both loved. Jed turned Martha's wedding ring between his calloused fingers, the simple gold band catching the early light. He'd taken to carrying it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart, though he couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was the weight of it, solid, real, a tangible reminder that their 43 years together hadn't been some beautiful dream. The ring had grown loose on her finger during those final months when the sickness stole her appetite and her strength, but never her spirit. Even at the end, she'd insisted on polishing it every Sunday before church, just as she had since their wedding day. You're going to wear a hole in that ring. Jed Tully, the voice belonged to Eleanor Whitmore, his nearest neighbor and the only person in Ciena Notreal who still spoke to him with anything resembling kindness. She approached from the dirt road that connected their properties, carrying a covered basket that undoubtedly contained more food than one man could possibly eat. Eleanor had made it her mission to keep him fed since Martha's passing, though they both knew the real nourishment he needed couldn't be found in any kitchen. Morning, Eleanor. Jed slipped the ring back into his pocket and stood, removing his hat out of ingrained courtesy. You didn't need to trouble yourself again. Trouble? Eleanor set the basket on the porch railing and fixed him with the stern look that had once kept a classroom full of children in line during her teaching days. The only trouble I see is a stubborn man who thinks grieving means he doesn't deserve to eat proper meals. She was a handsome woman. Eleanor, probably close to his own age, though she carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that made age irrelevant. Her grey hair was always neatly pinned back, her dresses simple but well-maintained, and her blue eyes held a depth that spoke of her own losses. Her husband Tom had died in a ranching accident 5 years back, leaving her to manage their small spread alone. Unlike Jed, she'd found a way to build something resembling a life from the pieces. Heard you caused quite a stir in town yesterday, she continued, unpacking what appeared to be fresh bread, cold chicken, and a jar of her famous preserves. Pete Jameson was telling anyone who'd listen about your latest acquisition, Jed grimaced. Pete owned the Silver Dollar Saloon and possessed the biggest mouth in 3 counties. If Pete was talking, the whole town knew by now. I suppose he had plenty to say. He said you traded your last horse for a rusty old safe that nobody's been able to open in 20 years. Eleanor's tone was carefully neutral, but Jed caught the concern underneath. Said it came from that ghost town auction over in Deadwood Hollow. The safe sat in his barn now, as immovable and silent as a gravestone. It stood nearly as tall as a man, its iron surface pitted with rust and age, bearing the scars of countless failed attempts to breach its secrets. The auctioneer had been honest about its condition, locked tight, combination unknown, probably empty anyway. Most folks had walked right past it, focused on the more obviously valuable items from the abandoned settlement, but Jed had lingered. Something about the safe called to him, though he couldn't have explained what if his life depended on it. Maybe it was the weight of mystery it carried, or maybe he'd simply reached the point where he needed something to hope for. No matter how foolish that hope might be. The old-timer running the auction said it belonged to Blackjack Morrison, Jed said, settling back into his chair. Claimed Morrison had hidden something valuable inside before he disappeared. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Blackjack Morrison. The outlaw? Jed, those are just stories. Legends that get bigger every time they're told. Maybe so. He watched a hawk circle lazily overhead, riding the thermals with an ease he envied. But legends have to start somewhere, don't they? The truth was more complicated than he cared to admit, even to Eleanor. The safe represented something he couldn't quite name. A puzzle to occupy his mind, a mystery to chase, anything to fill the hollow spaces that Martha's absence had carved in his daily existence. Without her gentle presence to anchor him, he'd found himself drifting through each day like a man walking through fog, going through the motions of living without any real purpose. Their ranch had once been a thriving operation, home to the finest cattle in the county. But Jed's heart hadn't been in the work since Martha took sick, and one by one he'd sold off the livestock to pay for doctors who couldn't help and medicines that didn't work. The horse he'd traded for the safe, a good gelding named Buck, had been his last connection to the life they'd built together. "You know Harrison's been asking questions about your loan payments," Eleanor said gently. "Word is he's getting pressure from the bank's board members. Daniel Harrison owned the First National Bank of Ciena Notreal and had been a friend to both Jed and Martha for decades. But friendship only stretched so far when money was involved, and Jed had missed his last 2 mortgage payments. The ranch that had been in his family for 3 generations might soon belong to strangers. Another casualty of his inability to move forward after loss. I know." He pulled Martha's ring from his pocket again, unable to help himself. "I'll figure something out." Eleanor watched him with patient eyes. "Tom used to do that with his pocket watch after his father died. Carry it everywhere, take it out whenever he was troubled. Said it helped him remember that some things endure, even when everything else falls apart." The comparison struck deeper than he expected. Tom Whitmore had been a good man, steady and reliable, the kind of neighbor who'd drop everything to help with a difficult calving or a barn raising. His death had shaken the whole community, but none more than Eleanor, who'd loved him with the quiet devotion that marked the strongest marriages. "How do you do it?" Jed asked. "How do you keep going when the person who made everything meaningful is gone?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains that ringed their valley. "I suppose I learned that grief isn't something you get over, it's something you carry. Like water in a bucket. At first, the bucket's so full it sloshes over with every step, making everything harder. But gradually, if you're careful, you learn to carry it without spilling. The water's still there, but it doesn't flood everything else." She touched his shoulder gently. "Martha wouldn't want you to drown in that bucket, Jed. She'd want you to find a way to keep walking." The words settled over him like a familiar blanket, offering comfort without promising easy solutions. Eleanor had a gift for saying what needed to be said without making it sound like preaching or pity. It was one of the reasons Martha had loved her so much, and one of the reasons Jed found himself looking forward to her visits more than he cared to admit. "The safe's just sitting there in the barn," he said eventually. "Big as life and twice as stubborn. Have you tried to open it?" "Spent 3 hours yesterday working at it with every tool I own. Might as well have been trying to crack the mountains themselves." Eleanor smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her in days. Maybe that's the point. Maybe some things aren't meant to be opened with tools and force. Maybe they require patience and the right touch. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the road. A rider was coming fast, dust trailing behind his horse like smoke. As he drew closer, Jed recognized Johnny Martinez, who worked odd jobs around town and had a habit of carrying news whether it was wanted or not. "Mr. Tully," Johnny called out as he reined in his mount. "Pete Jameson sent me to fetch you. Says there's someone in town asking about that safe you bought." Someone who knows something about Blackjack Morrison. Jed and Eleanor exchanged glances. The mystery that had seemed like a foolish old man's fancy suddenly felt more substantial, more real. Whatever secrets that safe contained, apparently Jed wasn't the only one interested in uncovering them. He stood slowly, Martha's ring warm against his palm, and felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in months. Curiosity, anticipation, maybe even hope. For the first time since Martha's death, the day ahead held possibilities instead of just another march through familiar emptiness. "Tell Pete I'll be along directly," he said to Johnny, who touched his hat and spurred his horse back toward town. Eleanor was already gathering the empty dishes from her basket. "I suppose this means you won't be eating that chicken while it's still warm. Save it for me?" Jed asked, settling his hat on his head. "I have a feeling this day's about to get interesting." As he saddled his remaining horse, an aging mare named Sage, who'd seen better decades, Jed couldn't shake the feeling that Martha's ring felt heavier in his pocket, as if it carried not just the weight of memory, but the promise of something yet to come. Maybe Eleanor was right about learning to carry grief without drowning in it. Maybe the safe represented more than just an old man's desperate grasp at purpose. Maybe, just maybe, some mysteries were worth solving, regardless of what the rest of the world thought about the man foolish enough to chase them. The Silver Dollar Saloon buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that preceded either a celebration or a fight, and Jed couldn't tell which this was shaping up to be. The stranger sat alone at a corner table, nursing a whiskey and studying every face that entered as if memorizing them for future reference. He was a small man, maybe 60, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades outdoors. But his clothes were too clean and his boots too polished for a drifter. Pete Jameson wiped down glasses behind the bar with more vigor than necessary, a sure sign he was either excited or worried. "That's him there," he whispered as Jed approached. "Been asking about your safe for near an hour now. Says his name's Cornelius Finch. Claims he's writing a book about frontier outlaws." Jed studied the stranger with the careful attention Martha had always teased him about. She'd called it his horse trader's eye, the ability to assess character and motivation with a single long look. Finch didn't strike him as a writer. His hands bore calluses in all the wrong places, and he held himself with the controlled alertness of a man accustomed to danger. "Mr. Tully?" Finch rose as Jed approached, extending a hand that was firm but not challenging. "Cornelius Finch, I understand you recently acquired a safe from the Deadwood Hollow auction. I'd very much like to discuss it with you." Jed accepted the handshake and took the offered chair. Pete appeared almost instantly with a beer, then retreated to a distance that was close enough to eavesdrop but far enough to maintain the pretense of privacy. Half the saloon was straining to listen, though they were trying to be subtle about it. "Depends on what you want to discuss," Jed said. "Pete tells me you're writing a book." Finch's smile was practiced, but didn't reach his eyes. "I'm researching the legend of Blackjack Morrison. Fascinating character. Robbed banks and stagecoaches across 3 territories, but unlike most outlaws, he was rumored to be quite methodical about his crimes. Kept detailed records, they say." "Records?" Jed sipped his beer and tried to look only mildly interested, though his pulse had quickened. "What kind of records?" "The kind that might interest certain parties even decades later." Finch leaned forward conspiratorially. "Morrison didn't just rob random targets, Mr. Tully. He was selective, strategic. Word is, he kept extensive notes about his victims, their habits, their weaknesses, their secrets. Some folks believe those records might still exist." The conversation was beginning to feel like a chess match where Jed didn't know the rules. He reached into his pocket and felt the reassuring weight of Martha's ring, using it to center himself the way she'd taught him during difficult cattle negotiations. "Interesting theory," Jed said carefully. "But why would you think I'd know anything about Morrison's records?" Finch pulled a crumpled paper from his coat pocket and smoothed it on the table between them. It was a yellowed auction flyer, the same one that had drawn Jed to Deadwood Hollow 3 weeks ago. Several items were circled in pencil, including the safe. Because you bought the one item that nobody else wanted, Finch said. The one item that's been sitting locked and untouched for 20 years. Most people would assume it's empty, worthless. But a man doesn't trade his last horse for worthless goods unless he knows something others don't. Jed studied the flyer, remembering that day with painful clarity. He'd driven to the auction on impulse, drawn by a restlessness he couldn't name, and a desperate need to be anywhere other than the empty ranch house. The abandoned settlement of Deadwood Hollow had been a mining town once, home to perhaps 200 souls before the silver played out, and the people drifted away to chase other dreams. The auctioneer had been a cheerful man named Wilkins, who spoke too fast and smiled too much. Most of the valuable items, furniture, tools, even architectural elements, had been claimed early by dealers from the big cities. By afternoon, only the locals remained, picking through the remnants like crows after a feast. Jed had been ready to leave when he noticed the safe standing forgotten in the corner of what had once been the town's bank. It wasn't particularly large or impressive, just a standard iron vault of the type found in businesses across the frontier. But something about it had called to him, a feeling he couldn't quite explain even now. The old-timer running the sale, Jed said slowly. He mentioned Morrison's name, said the safe had belonged to him, though he couldn't prove it. Finch's eyes sharpened with interest. What exactly did he tell you? Not much. Just that Morrison had supposedly used Deadwood Hollow as a hideout between jobs. Said the safe had been locked when the town was abandoned, and nobody'd been able to open it since. It had been more than that, though. Jed remembered the way Wilkins had looked around nervously before sharing what he called local folklore. According to him, Morrison hadn't just hidden money in that safe. He'd hidden information. Letters, documents, evidence that could ruin reputations and destroy lives. Even decades later, probably just an old man's stories, Jed had said at the time. But something in Wilkins' manner had suggested otherwise. The auctioneer had seemed genuinely worried about the safe's contents, as if he knew secrets that still had power to hurt people. And you believed him enough to trade a good horse for it, Finch observed. Jed shrugged. Sometimes a man makes decisions that don't look smart to outside observers. That was certainly true of his entire life lately. Martha would have called it one of his stubborn streaks. Those moments when he dug in his heels and refused to listen to reason. She'd usually been right about them being foolish, but she'd supported him anyway, trusting that his instincts would eventually lead somewhere worthwhile. The trade had been impulsive, driven by grief and a desperate need to feel connected to something larger than his own loss. Buck had been a good horse, worth at least 3 times what Jed had paid for the safe, but money wasn't really the point. The safe represented possibility, mystery, hope, things that had been in short supply since Martha's death. Have you attempted to open it? Finch asked. Spent most of yesterday trying. Things locked up tighter than a banker's vault. Perhaps I could take a look at it. I've had some experience with antique safes. There it was, the real reason for Finch's visit. Whatever story he'd told about writing a book, the man was clearly after something specific. The question was whether his interest aligned with Jed's own growing curiosity or represented some kind of threat. I might be willing to let you take a look, Jed said carefully. Assuming you're straight with me about why you're really here. Finch finished his whiskey and studied Jed for a long moment. Around them, the saloon had grown quieter as more patrons tuned in to their conversation. Word would be all over town within the hour, regardless of what they decided. There are people who believe Morrison's records could be embarrassing to certain families, Finch said finally. Families with long memories and deep pockets. They'd pay handsomely to make sure those records never see the light of day. The admission sent a chill through Jed that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. He thought about the strange looks he'd been getting around town since the auction, the way conversations stopped when he entered a room, the subtle but unmistakable shift in how people treated him. And what's your interest in all this? Jed asked. Let's just say I represent parties who believe the truth should come to light. Regardless of how uncomfortable it might make certain people, it wasn't really an answer. But it was probably the most honest thing Finch had said since sitting down. Jed finished his beer and stood, aware that every eye in the saloon was on him. "Come by my place tomorrow morning," he said. "We'll take a look at that safe together." As Jed walked out of the Silver Dollar, he could feel the weight of stares following him like physical pressure. By the time he mounted Sage for the ride home, he could hear the buzz of excited conversation resuming behind him. Whatever secrets that safe contained, the whole town would know he was trying to unlock them. The ride back to the ranch gave him time to think, and thinking led to doubts. Martha had always been his compass when it came to reading people and situations. Without her counsel, he felt like a man navigating by dead reckoning, hoping his instincts would prove reliable. But as he turned into his driveway and saw the safe sitting silent and imposing in his barn, Jed realized he'd passed the point of turning back. Whether Cornelius Finch represented opportunity or danger, whether the safe contained treasure or disappointment, the mystery had already taken hold of him. For the first time in months, he had something to do besides remember what he'd lost. That alone made whatever risks lay ahead worth taking. The Ciena Notreal Public Library occupied a modest brick building on Main Street, sandwiched between the hardware store and Mrs. Patterson's dress shop. It wasn't much to look at from the outside. 2 stories, narrow windows, and a sign that had needed repainting for the better part of a decade. But inside, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with the accumulated knowledge and forgotten stories of 3 generations. Jed hadn't set foot in the library since Martha's funeral arrangements, when he'd needed to research cemetery plot ownership and burial regulations. The musty smell of old paper and binding glue brought back memories of winter evenings, when Martha would insist they read together by the fire, taking turns with whatever novel had caught her fancy. She'd always been the reader in their marriage, though she'd gradually coaxed him into appreciating a good story. Mrs. Adelaide Fenwick, the librarian, looked up from her cataloguing with surprise. She was a spinster in her 70s, sharp as a tack and possessed of an encyclopedic knowledge of both the library's contents and the town's history. Her grey hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her wire-rimmed spectacles perched on her nose like sentries. "Jed Tully," she said, removing her glasses to clean them, a habit that signaled either surprise or disapproval. "I don't believe I've seen you since Martha's passing. How are you managing?" "Getting by, Mrs. Fenwick. I was hoping you might help me with some research." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Research? What sort of research?" "Local history. Specifically anything you might have about Blackjack Morrison." Mrs. Fenwick's expression shifted from polite interest to something approaching alarm. She glanced around the empty library, as if checking for eavesdroppers, then gestured for Jed to follow her to a table in the back corner. "Well away from the windows facing Main Street, may I ask why you're interested in Morrison?" she asked quietly. Jed settled into one of the wooden chairs, trying to appear casual despite the librarian's obvious nervousness. "Just curiosity, mostly. Heard some stories and wondered how much truth was in them." "Stories have a way of growing larger with each telling," Mrs. Fenwick said carefully. "Especially stories about men like Morrison. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." The warning was gentle but unmistakable. Jed studied the elderly woman's face, noting the tightness around her eyes and the way her hands fidgeted with her spectacles. Whatever she knew about Blackjack Morrison, it made her uncomfortable. "I understand your caution," Jed said, "but I'd still appreciate anything you can tell me. Official records, newspaper accounts, whatever you might have." Mrs. Fenwick sighed and stood slowly. "Wait here. I'll see what I can find." She disappeared into the stacks, leaving Jed alone with his thoughts and the ticking of an old grandfather clock that had probably been counting time since the library's founding. Through the tall windows, he could see people going about their daily business on Main Street, farmers loading supplies, women shopping, children playing in the small park across from the bank. It occurred to him that most of these people had probably lived in Ciena Notreal their entire lives, as had their parents and grandparents before them. The town's history wasn't just academic curiosity to them, it was family history, personal legacy, the foundation upon which their present lives were built. If Morrison's activities had somehow touched their ancestors, they might have good reason to prefer that certain stories remain untold. Mrs. Fenwick returned, carrying a slim folder and what appeared to be a photograph album. She set them on the table with the reverent care usually reserved for handling fragile antiques. "These are copies of newspaper accounts from the 1880s, she said, opening the folder. Morrison was active in this region for approximately 3 years before he disappeared. Most of what we know comes from these articles and a few court records. The newspaper clippings were yellowed with age, their headlines stark and dramatic in the style of frontier journalism. Outlaw band strikes again. Blackjack Morrison eludes pursuit. Territorial governor offers reward. Jed scanned them quickly, noting the progression of dates and the increasing urgency in the reporting. He wasn't just a common bandit, Mrs. Fenwick explained. Morrison was educated, methodical. He targeted specific banks and businesses, often in small towns like ours. The interesting thing is that he never seemed to steal more than necessary, just enough to fund his operations and support his gang. One article caught Jed's attention. Local businessman denies connection to outlaw activities. The story was brief and carefully worded, but it mentioned several prominent families in the region, including some surnames Jed recognized from current town leadership. "This mentions the Sinclair family," he said, pointing to the relevant passage. "Harold Sinclair's ancestors?" Mrs. Fenwick nodded reluctantly. "Among others. There were allegations, never proven, mind you, that Morrison had inside information about his targets. People whispered that he had help from respectable citizens who provided intelligence in exchange for protection or profit. The implications settled over Jed like a cold wind. If Morrison had indeed kept records of his activities, and if those records implicated founding families of Ciena Notreal, the contents of that safe could reshape the town's entire understanding of its own history. "There's something else," Mrs. Fenwick said, opening the photograph album. "This belonged to my predecessor, Miss Caroline Hartwell. She was fascinated by local history and collected everything she could find." The album contained perhaps 24 photographs, most of them formal portraits or group shots from the town's early days. Mrs. Fenwick turned pages slowly until she found what she was looking for, a worn photograph mounted with small corner tabs. This was taken outside the Deadwood Hollow Bank, probably around 1883, she said. "Miss Hartwell acquired it from an estate sale years ago." Jed leaned forward to study the image. It showed 3 men standing in front of a wooden building, their poses stiff and formal in the manner of early photography. 2 of them looked like typical frontier businessmen, well-dressed, respectable, unremarkable. But the 3rd man commanded attention, despite his ordinary appearance. He was of medium height and build, with dark hair and a carefully trimmed beard. His clothes were good quality, but not ostentatious, and he wore them with the confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. But it was his eyes that made Jed catch his breath, intelligent, calculating, and somehow familiar. "The man on the right," Mrs. Fenwick said quietly, "is believed to be Blackjack Morrison himself, one of the few confirmed photographs of him in existence." Jed stared at the image, trying to reconcile this respectable-looking gentleman with the notorious outlaw of newspaper accounts. Morrison didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a banker or merchant, someone you'd trust with your money or your secrets. "May I borrow this?" Jed asked. Mrs. Fenwick hesitated. "I'm not sure that's wise." "Jed, some folks in town might not appreciate you stirring up old questions about their families. All the more reason to know what those questions might be." After a moment's internal struggle, she carefully removed the photograph from its mounting tabs and handed it to him. "Be careful with it," she said. "And be careful with yourself. History has a way of biting back when you disturb it." Jed slipped the photograph into his shirt pocket next to Martha's ring. The 2 items seemed to resonate against each other, one representing his past, the other potentially illuminating secrets from a much more distant time. As he prepared to leave, Mrs. Fenwick caught his arm gently. "Jed, I've known you since you were a boy coming in here with your mother. You're a good man, but you're grieving, and grief can make us do things we might regret later. Whatever you think that safe contains, ask yourself if it's worth the trouble it might bring. Outside the library, Jed paused on the steps to study the photograph again. In the afternoon light, Morrison's face seemed even more familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen those features before. The other two men remained anonymous, but something about their posture suggested they were more than casual acquaintances of the notorious outlaw. As he walked back toward where he'd left Sage tied to a hitching post, Jed became aware of being watched. Nothing obvious, just the subtle awareness that comes from years of reading cattle and weather and other things that don't speak their intentions aloud. When he glanced around, he saw people going about their normal business, but there was something in their expressions, a guardedness that hadn't been there before his visit to the library. Word traveled fast in a small town, and apparently word had already spread about his research into Blackjack Morrison. The question was whether that word would reach Cornelius Finch before their morning meeting, and what the stranger's reaction might be to learning that Jed was conducting his own investigation. One thing was certain. The photograph in his pocket represented more than just historical curiosity. It was evidence that Morrison had indeed operated in this area, possibly with local assistance, and that the secrets locked in that safe might be more explosive than anyone had imagined. As Jed mounted Sage for the ride home, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow's meeting with Finch with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Whether the man proved to be ally or adversary, at least Jed would have questions of his own to ask. Cornelius Finch arrived at dawn, materializing from the morning mist, like a man accustomed to traveling unnoticed. Jed watched him approach from the kitchen window while nursing his second cup of coffee, noting how the stranger's eyes swept the property with professional thoroughness. Whatever Finch's real business might be, he possessed the awareness of someone who'd spent time in dangerous places. "Mr. Tully!" Finch called out as Jed emerged from the house. "I hope I'm not too early." "Been up since 4:30, Jed replied. "Coffee's hot if you want some." They sat on the porch for a few minutes, two men sizing each other up over steaming mugs while the sun painted the eastern mountains in shades of rose and gold. Finch seemed different in the morning light, less polished, more authentic, as if the dawn had stripped away some of his careful veneer. "You've been asking questions around town," Finch said eventually. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact, but Jed felt a prickle of wariness. "Word travels fast in Ciena Notreal." "Fast enough. Mrs. Fenwick mentioned your visit to anyone who'd listen. Apparently you borrowed a photograph." Jed set down his coffee cup and studied his visitor more carefully. "You've been busy since yesterday." "It's what I do." Finch's smile was self-deprecating, but his eyes remained sharp. "May I see the photograph?" Jed retrieved it from his shirt pocket and handed it over. Finch examined the image with the intensity of a jeweler appraising a diamond, turning it slightly to catch the light and studying every detail. "This is Morrison, all right," he said finally. "One of only 3 confirmed photographs in existence, but it's the other 2 men that make this interesting. You recognize them. The man on the left is Benjamin Hartwell, Miss Caroline Hartwell's grandfather. He owned the Mercantile in Deadwood Hollow and several other businesses throughout the territory. Respectable citizen, member of the town council, pillar of the community." Finch paused, clearly waiting for Jed to ask the obvious question. "And the other man?" "Thomas Sinclair, Harold Sinclair's great-grandfather. Founded the family fortune through land speculation and cattle ranching." Finch handed the photograph back. According to official records, both men were victims of Morrison's criminal activities. According to this photograph, they were something more like business partners. The implications hit Jed like a physical blow. If the founding families of the region had been secretly collaborating with Blackjack Morrison, the contents of that safe could destroy reputations that had been carefully maintained for decades. No wonder people seemed nervous about his investigation. "We should look at that safe," Finch said, standing, "before anyone else decides to pay you a visit. The barn was cool and shadowy, smelling of hay and leather and the lingering presence of horses long gone. The safe stood in the far corner like a monument to secrets, its iron surface gleaming dully in the light that filtered through the open doors. Finch circled it slowly, running his hands over the metal and examining the lock mechanism with professional interest. "Standard Mosler design from the 1870s, he murmured. Three-wheel combination lock, hardened steel face. Someone put some serious effort into keeping this closed. He pulled a small leather pouch from his coat and extracted what appeared to be a medical instrument, something between tweezers and a small pick. As he began working on the lock, Jed noticed scoring around the dial that suggested previous attempts to break in. "You're not really a writer, are you?" Jed asked. "I've written a few things," Finch replied, not looking up from his work. "But you're right, it's not my primary occupation. I'm what you might call a recovery specialist. I help people find things that have been lost or hidden. Who hired you to find this safe? Let's just say there are parties interested in ensuring that certain historical documents don't fall into the wrong hands." Finch paused in his work and glanced up. "The question is whether you represent the right hands or the wrong ones." Jed was considering how to answer when his attention was caught by something he'd never noticed before. The morning light, streaming through the barn doors at just the right angle, revealed faint markings scratched into the safe surface near the base. He knelt for a closer look and discovered what appeared to be letters or numbers, worn almost smooth by time but still barely visible. "There's something here," he said, running his fingers over the scratches. Finch abandoned the lock and joined him on the floor. Together, they traced the markings, trying to decipher what appeared to be a partial message or code. Some letters were clearer than others, and gaps where the iron had rusted made interpretation difficult. "It looks like wait." Finch pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and began sketching the visible marks. "This could be part of a larger message. See how the scratches continue down here under this rust stain?" They worked for nearly an hour, carefully cleaning decades of grime and oxidation from the safe's surface. Gradually, a pattern emerged, not quite a complete message, but fragments that hinted at something larger. What they could make out appeared to be a partial letter or note, scratched directly into the iron. Evidence hidden, banking records, families involved. "Trust no one in Ciena Notreal," Jed said quietly. He was warning someone not to trust anyone in Ciena Notreal. Finch nodded grimly. Morrison knew he was in danger. This looks like a message he left for someone, maybe a partner, maybe an enemy. Either way, it suggests the safe contains exactly what we think it does. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their examination. Jed rose and peered through the barn door to see 3 riders approaching: Mayor Harrison, Harold Sinclair, and Sheriff Coleman. They rode with the purposeful determination of men on official business. Though what that business might be remained unclear. "Trouble," Jed muttered. Finch quickly pocketed his tools and moved away from the safe as the riders reined in outside the barn. Mayor Harrison dismounted first, his face grave beneath his carefully waxed mustache. Harold Sinclair followed, his expensive clothes and polished boots marking him as the wealthiest man in the county. Sheriff Coleman remained mounted, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Morning, Jed," Harrison said, though his tone suggested anything but a friendly social call. "We need to have a word with you." "About what?" "About the disturbance you're causing in town with all these questions about ancient history." Sinclair stepped forward, his pale eyes cold and calculating. "People are getting upset, worried about what kind of stories you might be spreading." Jed felt anger rising in his chest. "I wasn't aware that visiting the library was against the law." "It's not the visiting that concerns us," Sheriff Coleman said from his saddle. "It's the questions you're asking and the attention you're attracting. We've got strangers coming to town asking about you, about that safe. That makes people nervous." His gaze shifted to Finch, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. "I don't believe we've been introduced. Cornelius Finch. I'm writing a book about frontier outlaws. Are you now?" Sinclair's voice carried the contempt of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "And what brings a writer all the way to our little town?" "Mr. Tully's recent acquisition." Local folklore suggests it belonged to Blackjack Morrison. The temperature in the barn seemed to drop 10 degrees. Harrison's face tightened, and Sinclair took a step closer to the safe as if to physically block access to it. "That's exactly the kind of wild speculation we're here to discourage," Harrison said firmly. Morrison was a common criminal who operated throughout the territory. "There's no evidence he ever set foot in Ciena Notreal, let alone left property here. The auction records from Deadwood Hollow suggest otherwise," Jed replied. "Auction records can be mistaken," Sheriff Coleman said. "Sometimes it's better not to chase every rumor and fairy tale you hear." The warning was unmistakable, delivered with the authority of a man who wore a badge and carried a gun. But something in Coleman's manner bothered Jed, a nervousness that seemed out of proportion to the situation. "I appreciate the advice," Jed said carefully, "but I can't see how my private property concerns anyone else." Sinclair's face flushed red above his expensive collar. "Your private property becomes public concern when you start spreading lies about respectable families. Some of us have worked hard to build this town's reputation, and we won't stand by while some grief-addled fool destroys it with wild stories." The insult struck deep, and Jed felt his hands clench into fists. Martha had always cautioned him about his temper, but Martha wasn't here to provide gentle restraint. "I'd be careful about calling people fools, Harold," Jed said quietly, "especially when you don't know what they might have learned." For a moment, the barn was silent, except for the stamping of horses and the distant sound of wind in the rafters. Then Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. "Nobody's calling anyone names," he said. "We're just suggesting that it might be wise to let sleeping dogs lie. Some stories are better left untold, even true ones." Finch asked. "Especially true ones," Sinclair snapped, then caught himself as if realizing he'd said too much. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Jed exchanged glances with Finch, both men recognizing that they'd just confirmed their suspicions about the safe's contents. "We'll be keeping an eye on things," Sheriff Coleman said, gathering his reins. "Make sure everything stays peaceful and law-abiding." The three men remounted and rode away, leaving Jed and Finch alone with their questions and the safe that seemed to grow more mysterious by the hour. "Well," Finch said after they'd disappeared, "that was illuminating." "They're scared," Jed agreed. "Question is, what are they scared of?" Finch knelt beside the safe again and resumed his work on the lock. "With any luck, we're about to find out." 3 days had passed since the confrontation in the barn, and Jed found himself looking over his shoulder with increasing frequency. Nothing dramatic had happened, no direct threats, no obvious surveillance, but the atmosphere in town had shifted in subtle ways that made him uncomfortable. Conversations stopped when he entered stores. People crossed the street to avoid passing too close. And even Pete Jameson had grown uncharacteristically quiet when Jed stopped by the Silver Dollar. Eleanor noticed the change too. She'd taken to visiting more frequently, always with some plausible excuse about sharing meals or checking on his health. But Jed could see the worry in her eyes. This morning she'd arrived with fresh bread and the determined expression of a woman preparing for a difficult conversation. "This has gone far enough." "Jed," she said, setting down her basket with more force than necessary. "Half the town is acting like you've got some contagious disease, and the other half looks ready to run you out on a rail." They sat at his kitchen table, the same one where he and Martha had shared countless meals and conversations. Sunlight streamed through windows that Martha had always kept spotless, but which now bore the dust and neglect of a man living alone. "I can't just stop now," Jed said, cradling his coffee cup like a lifeline. "Not when I'm finally starting to understand what's been hidden all these years." "Understand what, exactly?" "That some people's ancestors might have done questionable things 50 years ago. Does it really matter enough to risk your safety?" Eleanor's frustration was evident, but underneath it, Jed detected something else. Fear, not just for his well-being, but for her own. The realization that his investigation might be putting her in danger made his stomach turn. "Tell me about your late husband's family," he said suddenly. "The Whitmores." "How long have they been in this area?" Eleanor's expression grew wary. What does that have to do with anything? Just curious about the town's history, trying to understand how all these families connect. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the mountains that ringed their valley. Tom's grandfather settled here in the 1870s, she said finally. Bought land from one of the original homesteaders who was moving on to Oregon. It was all legitimate, properly recorded at the territorial office. What was the homesteader's name? I'm not sure. Tom mentioned it once, but I don't remember. She turned back to him with pleading eyes. Jed, please. Whatever you think you're going to find, it's not worth destroying your life over. But even as she spoke, Jed could see that she was holding something back. There was knowledge in her expression, secrets that she carried but didn't want to share. The realization that Eleanor might be keeping things from him stung more than the town's collective cold shoulder. After she left, Jed made a decision that felt both necessary and dangerous. He would return to the library, but this time he'd dig deeper into the town's official records. If land transactions were involved in whatever Blackjack Morrison had documented, there would be paper trails that even decades couldn't erase completely. Mrs. Fenwick looked less than pleased to see him, though she maintained her professional courtesy. Back again, Jed? I thought our previous conversation might have satisfied your curiosity. I'm interested in early land records, he said. Specifically property transfers from the 1870s and 1880s. Her face went pale. Those records are stored in the basement. They're not generally available for public viewing. I'm not the general public. Mrs. Fenwick, I'm a tax-paying citizen of this county with a legitimate interest in public records. After a brief internal struggle, she led him down a narrow staircase to a basement that smelled of mildew and forgotten time. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers labeled with dates that stretched back to the territory's founding. Mrs. Fenwick pulled out a thick folder and set it on a scarred wooden table. These are the original land deeds and transfer documents, she said reluctantly. Please be careful with them. They're irreplaceable. Left alone with the records, Jed began the painstaking process of tracing property ownership through the decades. The documents were handwritten in fading ink, some barely legible, but gradually a pattern began to emerge that made his blood run cold. In 1879, a homesteader named James Whitmore had owned nearly 3,000 acres of prime grazing land in the valley. The deed was properly recorded and signed by territorial officials. But just 6 months later, the same land had been transferred to Thomas Sinclair for what appeared to be a fraction of its actual value. The transfer document was signed by Whitmore, but something about the signature looked wrong, shakier than the confident hand that had signed the original deed. More troubling was a notation in the margin, written in different ink, subject to outstanding debts and liens as per settlement agreement. Jed found similar irregularities in other records. Over the course of 3 years, several established homesteaders had sold their properties to a small group of buyers, the same families that now dominated Ciena Notreal's social and economic landscape. In every case, the sales prices seemed far below market value, and in several cases there were mysterious references to settlement agreements and debt satisfaction. The final piece fell into place when he discovered a court document dated 1882. James Whitmore had petitioned the Territorial Court for protection against unlawful intimidation and threats to personal safety. The petition detailed how armed men had visited his property repeatedly, demanding payment of alleged debts that Whitmore claimed were fraudulent. But the most damning evidence was a witness statement attached to the petition. A woman named Sarah Morrison had testified that she'd overheard planning meetings between local businessmen and known criminals, including her own brother, a man she identified as Jack Morrison, also known as Blackjack. Jed stared at the document with growing horror. Sarah Morrison had been willing to testify against her own brother to protect innocent homesteaders from what amounted to an organized extortion scheme. The petition had been filed in September 1882. According to newspaper accounts, Blackjack Morrison had disappeared from the territory in October of the same year, And Sarah Morrison had died in a house fire just weeks later. The pattern was clear now. The founding families of Ciena Notreal hadn't built their fortunes through honest business dealings. They'd used Morrison's gang to intimidate legitimate landowners into selling at below-market prices. The respectable citizens photographed with Morrison hadn't been his victims. They'd been his partners in a systematic campaign of theft and fraud. And somewhere in that locked safe, Morrison had kept the evidence that could prove it all. Jed was so absorbed in the documents that he didn't hear footsteps on the stairs until it was too late. He looked up to find Harold Sinclair standing in the doorway, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. "Find anything interesting?" Sinclair asked, moving closer to the table. "Just reading about the early days," Jed replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Fascinating how this community came together." Sinclair's eyes fixed on the documents spread across the table, and Jed saw recognition flicker across his features. The man knew exactly what these records contained and what they meant for his family's reputation. "Some history is better left buried," Sinclair said quietly. "My great-grandfather built this town through hard work and honest dealing. I won't have his memory besmirched by the ravings of a grief-stricken old fool, even if those ravings happen to be true." Sinclair's hand moved to his coat pocket, and for a terrifying moment Jed thought the man might be reaching for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a thick envelope. $5,000, Sinclair said, placing it on the table. "More than enough to pay off your debts and start fresh somewhere else. All you have to do is pack up that safe and leave Ciena Notreal forever." The offer hung in the air between them like a challenge. $5,000 was more money than Jed had seen in years, enough to solve all his immediate problems and give him a comfortable retirement. All he had to do was walk away from the truth and let the dead keep their secrets. He thought of Martha, of the values she'd tried to instill in him, of the importance she'd placed on doing what was right, regardless of the personal cost. Then he thought of James Whitmore and the other homesteaders who'd been driven from their land by fear and fraud, their sacrifices forgotten by history. "Keep your money, Harold," Jed said, standing slowly. "Some things aren't for sale." Sinclair's face darkened with rage. "You have no idea what you're meddling with, old man. This goes deeper than you can possibly imagine, and it involves people who won't hesitate to protect their interests." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact. The same fate that befell certain troublemakers in the past could easily befall others who don't know when to mind their own business." With that, Sinclair turned and climbed the stairs, leaving Jed alone with the weight of what he'd discovered and the growing certainty that his investigation had moved far beyond simple historical curiosity. He was now dealing with people who had killed to protect their secrets in the past, and might well be willing to kill again. As he carefully returned the documents to their folders, Jed realized there was no turning back now. The truth was too important to abandon, regardless of the personal cost. But he also realized he couldn't face this alone. He needed help, and he had a growing suspicion about where he might find it. Eleanor was waiting for him when he returned from the library, sitting on his porch with the patience of a woman who'd made a difficult decision. Her face was pale but resolute, and she clutched a small wooden box in her lap like a lifeline. The sight of her there, silhouetted against the late afternoon sky, reminded Jed so powerfully of Martha that for a moment he could barely breathe. "We need to talk," she said as he approached. "Really talk this time. No more dancing around the truth." Jed settled into the chair beside her, noting the tension in her posture and the way her knuckles had gone white from gripping the box. Whatever she'd come to tell him, it was costing her considerable effort. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "About Tom's death, about my family's history, about why I've been so worried about your investigation." She opened the box with trembling fingers, revealing a collection of papers, photographs, and what appeared to be a small leather journal. The smell of old paper and faded ink drifted up between them, carrying with it the weight of secrets too long kept. "Tom didn't die in a ranching accident," Eleanor said, her words falling like stones into still water. He was murdered. And I think it was because of what he'd discovered about this town's founding families. Jed felt the world shift around him, pieces of a puzzle suddenly rearranging themselves into a picture far darker than he'd imagined. "Eleanor, let me finish," she interrupted, pulling a folded paper from the box. Before I lose my courage, the document she handed him appeared to be a list of names written in careful handwriting. Jed recognized some of them immediately. Current town leaders, prominent businessmen, even Sheriff Coleman's name appeared near the bottom. Next to each name was a dollar amount and what looked like coded references to specific incidents or services. "Tom found this hidden in our barn last summer," Eleanor explained. "It was tucked inside an old saddle that had belonged to his grandfather, the original James Whitmore." The name hit Jed like a physical blow. "The homesteader who petitioned the court for protection," Eleanor nodded miserably. "Tom's grandfather wasn't just any victim of the land grab scheme. He was the one who tried to fight back. And according to what Tom pieced together, this list documents ongoing corruption that's been passed down through generations." Jed studied the list more carefully, beginning to understand its significance. The names weren't just historical figures. They represented a network of influence and intimidation that had apparently continued operating long after Blackjack Morrison's disappearance. "This is a blackmail list," he said slowly. "Someone's been using information about the original crimes to control people for decades." Tom thought so too. He spent months researching, trying to understand how deep it all went. Eleanor pulled out a small photograph. Tom Whitmore, a man Jed remembered as honest and forthright, standing next to what appeared to be an old mine shaft. He was convinced that Morrison had hidden evidence in multiple locations, not just the safe. He thought there might be documents cached in the abandoned mines around Deadwood Hollow. Is that where he was when he died? Eleanor's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks as she nodded. "They said his horse threw him near the old Lucky Strike mine. Said he hit his head on the rocks and died instantly. But Tom was one of the best riders in the county. He'd never been thrown by any horse." Jed reached out and took her hand, feeling the tremor of grief and fear that ran through her like electricity. "Why didn't you tell anyone your suspicions?" "Tell who?" "Sheriff Coleman's name is on that list. Mayor Harrison's father is mentioned in Tom's notes. Half the town council has connections to the original conspirators." She wiped her eyes with her free hand. "I was alone and scared, and I had no proof of anything except a dead husband and a box full of old papers that could get me killed too." The enormity of what she was revealing settled over Jed like a heavy blanket. They weren't just dealing with historical crimes. They were confronting an ongoing criminal conspiracy that had maintained power in Ciena Notreal for generations. "There's more," Eleanor said, pulling out Tom's journal. He documented meetings, conversations he overheard, patterns of influence and intimidation. He was building a case, planning to take it to federal authorities. Jed opened the journal and found page after page of meticulous notes written in Tom's careful hand. Names, dates, incidents, a careful documentation of how power really worked in their seemingly peaceful community. One entry in particular caught his attention. Overheard Harrison and Sinclair discussing the Morrison problem at the bank. Harrison mentioned that certain documents needed to be recovered before they fell into the wrong hands. Sinclair suggested that extreme measures might be necessary to protect family interests. Both men seemed convinced that someone knew the location of additional evidence. "Tom wrote that just 2 weeks before he died," Eleanor said, reading over his shoulder. "I think they found out about his investigation. The implications were staggering. If Tom Whitmore had been murdered to silence him, then Jed's own investigation had put him in mortal danger. More than that, it had put Eleanor at risk simply by association. "You have to leave town," he said urgently. "Take these documents and go somewhere safe until this is resolved." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "I'm not running away again. I've spent 5 years living in fear, watching these people get away with murder while Tom's death was written off as an accident. If there's finally a chance to expose the truth, I'm not going to waste it." Eleanor, these people have already killed once to protect their secrets. They won't hesitate to kill again. Then we'd better make sure we get to the truth before they get to us." She stood up, clutching Tom's journal to her chest. Tom believed the safe was just one piece of a larger puzzle. If Morrison really did hide evidence in multiple locations, we need to find it all before they can destroy what's left. Jed studied her face in the fading light, seeing determination that reminded him powerfully of Martha's stubborn courage. Eleanor Whitmore had been shaped by loss just as he had, but she'd found a way to transform grief into purpose. "There's something else," she said, hesitating. "Something I haven't told you about my own family." "What?" "My maiden name was Morrison. Zara Morrison was my great-aunt." The revelation hit Jed like a lightning bolt. Eleanor wasn't just a concerned neighbor who'd been drawn into his investigation. She was a direct descendant of the woman who'd tried to expose the conspiracy in 1882, Sarah. Morrison was willing to testify against her own brother to protect innocent people, Eleanor continued. She died for that courage, but not before she passed certain information down through the family. Information about where Jack Morrison might have hidden his insurance policy against his so-called business partners. "You know where the other caches are? I know where Sarah thought they might be. And I know that Tom was getting close to finding them when he died." Eleanor's eyes met his, blazing with newfound determination. "The question is whether you're willing to help me finish what he started." As the last light faded from the western sky, Jed realized that his simple desire to solve the mystery of a locked safe had evolved into something far more significant. He was now part of a multi-generational struggle between truth and corruption, justice and power, courage and fear. Looking at Eleanor's determined face, thinking of Martha's values and Tom Whitmore's sacrifice, he knew there was only one answer he could give. When do we start? They worked through the night by lantern light. Jed and Eleanor bent over the safe, like surgeons, attempting a delicate operation. Tom's journal had provided the crucial clue they needed, a reference to scratch marks that form not random damage, but a deliberate code. Sarah Morrison had apparently taught her nephew to hide messages in plain sight, using techniques that appeared accidental to casual observers. "Try the sequence again," Eleanor whispered. Exhaustion evident in her voice, but determination keeping her alert. Tom wrote that Sarah used family birthdays as combinations, significant dates that wouldn't be forgotten but wouldn't be obvious to outsiders. Jed's fingers worked the dial with practiced patience. 3 numbers to the right, 2 to the left, 1 back to the right. The combination that had eluded him for weeks suddenly seemed to flow naturally from the markings they'd deciphered. On the safe's surface, the click when it came was so soft that at first neither of them was certain they'd heard it. Then the massive door swung open with a groan of hinges that hadn't moved in decades, revealing an interior that made them both gasp in astonishment. The safe was far from empty. Papers filled every available inch. Documents, photographs, ledgers, and correspondence organized with the methodical precision of a man who understood the power of information. But what captured their immediate attention was a large manila envelope marked "Final Insurance" in bold letters across the front. Eleanor reached for it with trembling hands. "This is it," she breathed. "This has to be what Tom was looking for." Inside the envelope was a collection of documents that redefined everything they thought they knew about Black Jack Morrison and the founding of Ciena Notreal. The first item was a birth certificate that made Jed's blood run cold. "John Morrison Sinclair," Eleanor read aloud. "Born November 15th, 1845, to William Sinclair and Mary Morrison Sinclair." Jed stared at the document, his mind struggling to process its implications. Morrison wasn't just working with the Sinclair family. He was a Sinclair, Harold's great-uncle. The birth certificate was accompanied by a detailed family tree that revealed the scope of Morrison's blood connections to the town's founding families. Not only was he related to the Sinclairs, but through marriages and business partnerships, he had family ties to nearly every prominent name in the region. "This changes everything," Eleanor whispered. Morrison wasn't an outside criminal who corrupted respectable businessmen. He was family, working to build a criminal empire that would benefit his relatives for generations to come. The next document made the situation even more explosive. It was a formal partnership agreement dated 1878, signed by John Morrison Sinclair and 5 other men representing the area's most prominent families. The agreement outlined a systematic plan to acquire valuable land through intimidation, fraud, and violence, with profits to be shared among the partners and their descendants. "Look at this," Jed said, pointing to a clause near the bottom of the agreement. "They planned it all from the beginning. The outlaw persona, the staged robberies to provide cover for their real activities, even the eventual disappearance when things got too hot." Eleanor was examining another document, a detailed accounting ledger that showed exactly how the scheme had operated. Specific homesteaders were targeted based on the value of their land and their vulnerability to intimidation. Morrison's gang would create incidents designed to make the victims appear to owe money or be in legal jeopardy, then offer to settle the matter in exchange for property transfers at below-market prices. "James Whitmore wasn't the only one who fought back," she said, running her finger down a list of names. "Look, there were at least a dozen homesteaders who refused the initial offers. Most of them eventually sold anyway, but a few held out until—" She stopped, her face going pale as she read the notations beside certain names. "Until what?" Jed prompted. "Until they had accidents," she finished quietly. Tom's grandfather wasn't the only one who died under suspicious circumstances. Anyone who threatened to expose the scheme was eliminated. The safe contained detailed records of these eliminations, including specific instructions for making murders appear accidental. Morrison had been thorough in documenting his family's crimes, apparently as insurance against betrayal by his partners. But the most shocking revelation came in a series of letters between Morrison and his sister Sarah. The correspondence revealed that Sarah hadn't been an innocent whistleblower. She'd been Morrison's accomplice, until a crisis of conscience drove her to attempt exposing the entire operation. "My God," Eleanor breathed, reading one of the letters. Sarah wasn't trying to protect strangers from her brother's crimes. She was trying to protect her own grandson, Tom's father, from being drawn into the family business. The letter detailed Sarah's growing horror as she realized that the criminal conspiracy was intended to continue across generations, with each family's children being gradually introduced to the network of corruption and violence that maintained their privileged positions. Sarah had threatened to expose everything unless Morrison disbanded the operation and made restitution to the victims. Morrison's reply was chillingly matter-of-fact. Sarah's death in the house fire hadn't been an accident. It had been a demonstration to other family members of what happened to those who threatened the enterprise. "He killed his own sister," Jed said, his voice hollow with shock, "and bragged about it in writing," Eleanor added. Morrison wasn't just documenting his crimes, he was threatening his own relatives with the same fate if they ever considered betraying the family interests. The final document in the envelope was, perhaps the most damning of all. It was a detailed plan for the transition of power following Morrison's planned disappearance, including specific instructions for maintaining the criminal network under legitimate business cover. Each family would control specific aspects of the operation: banking, law enforcement, land development, and political influence. The plan had apparently worked exactly as designed. For more than 40 years, Morrison's heirs had maintained their grip on Ciena Notreal through a combination of inherited wealth, strategic corruption, and carefully applied intimidation. Anyone who got too close to the truth suffered the same fate as James Whitmore and Tom Whitmore. Convenient accidents that served as warnings to others. "This explains everything," Eleanor said, sinking back on her heels. "Why Sheriff Coleman is on the payroll. Why Mayor Harrison was so nervous about your investigation. Why Harold Sinclair offered you money to leave town. They're all still part of it." Jed was studying a map that had been tucked behind the other documents. It showed the locations of additional document caches throughout the region, marked with symbols that corresponded to a code key included with the map. Morrison was smarter than anyone realized, he said. He didn't just hide evidence in one location. He created multiple insurance policies scattered across the territory. If one cache was discovered or destroyed, the others would still exist to expose the conspiracy. How many other locations are there? According to this map, at least 6. And they're all in places that would be accessible to someone who knew what to look for, but invisible to casual observers. Eleanor stood slowly, stretching muscles cramped from hours of hunching over documents. Tom found at least 2 of these locations before he died. That's why they killed him. He was getting too close to having enough evidence to destroy them all. The weight of their discovery settled over them like a physical presence. They now possessed evidence that could not only expose historical crimes, but prove ongoing criminal conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of local government. The question was whether they could stay alive long enough to see justice done. As if summoned by their thoughts, the sound of approaching vehicles broke the pre-dawn silence. Through the barn windows, they could see headlights cutting through the darkness. Multiple vehicles moving slowly up the ranch road with the deliberate caution of hunters closing in on dangerous prey. They know, Eleanor whispered. Someone told them we opened the safe. Jed quickly gathered the most damning documents and stuffed them into a canvas bag. There's a root cellar under the kitchen floor, he said urgently. If something happens to us, that's where you hid these papers. Make sure someone trustworthy knows where to look. Eleanor nodded, her face pale but resolute. What do we do now? Through the windows, they could see men moving through the darkness, surrounding the barn with military precision. Whatever was about to happen, there would be no escape and no negotiation. Now we find out just how far they're willing to go to protect their secrets, Jed said. Checking to make sure Martha's ring was still in his pocket. Somehow, having it close gave him courage he hadn't known he possessed, the confrontation he'd been unconsciously preparing for since the day he bought the safe was finally at. And the first voice that called out from the darkness belonged to Sheriff Coleman. But it carried none of the official authority Jed had come to expect from the man. Instead, it held the hard edge of someone operating outside the boundaries of law and conscience. Jed Tully. Coleman's voice echoed in the pre-dawn stillness. You and Mrs. Whitmore need to come out of that barn. We need to have a conversation about what you've been up to. Jed and Eleanor pressed themselves against the barn wall, trying to stay out of sight while counting the shadows moving through the yard. At least 6 men surrounded the building, and more headlights were visible on the road leading to the ranch. How many people are involved in this conspiracy? Eleanor whispered. More than we thought, apparently. Jed was frantically searching through the safe's remaining contents, looking for anything that might give them leverage in the confrontation ahead. His fingers closed on a thick bundle of papers tied with string, documents he'd overlooked in their initial excitement over the birth certificate and partnership agreement. The bundle contained what appeared to be Morrison's personal journal, written in the meticulous hand of a man who understood the value of detailed records. But unlike the business documents, this journal revealed the psychological toll of leading a double life for years. Entry after entry detailed Morrison's growing paranoia as the conspiracy expanded and more people became involved. He'd begun to suspect that his partners were planning to eliminate him once his usefulness ended. And he'd started documenting everything as protection against betrayal. One entry, dated just weeks before his disappearance, made Jed's blood run cold. The network has grown beyond my ability to control. What began as a simple land acquisition scheme now encompasses murder, extortion, and corruption at every level of territorial government. My partners no longer see me as an asset. They see me as a liability who knows too much. Sarah's death was meant as a warning to me as much as anyone else. They're planning something, I'm certain. I must accelerate my own plans for disappearance before they can act. The final entry was even more disturbing. I've prepared one last insurance policy, a complete confession detailing every crime, every murder, every act of corruption from the beginning. If anything happens to me, if I disappear under circumstances other than my own choosing, this confession will serve as proof that the Morrison legend was carefully constructed to hide the truth. My real name is John Morrison Sinclair, and I am not the mastermind of this conspiracy. I am its victim, as surely as any homesteader we've driven from his land. The real power lies with my cousin Thomas Sinclair and his allies, who created the Blackjack Morrison persona to distance themselves from the violence necessary to build their empire. Eleanor was reading over his shoulder, her face growing paler with each revelation. He wasn't the leader, she breathed. He was the fall guy, and they killed him when he started getting too independent, Jed realized. The mysterious disappearance wasn't an escape, it was murder. The confession continued for several pages, detailing specific crimes and naming names with the precision of a man who knew his words might be his only weapon against powerful enemies. Morrison had documented not just the original conspiracy, but its planned evolution into a multi-generational criminal enterprise that would control the region's economic and political development for decades to come. Jed! Coleman's voice was getting closer. I'm losing patience. Come out now, and we can discuss this like civilized men. Keep hiding, and things are going to get unpleasant. What do they want? Eleanor whispered. Same thing they've always wanted, to bury the truth and protect their power. Jed was studying the confession's final page, which contained detailed instructions for finding Morrison's body and additional evidence he'd hidden before his planned confrontation with his partners. According to the document, Morrison had anticipated his own murder and had prepared accordingly. His body would be found in a specific location, along with proof of how he'd really died, but only if someone knew exactly where to look and what to look for. They can't let us live, Eleanor said quietly. Not after what we've discovered. Jed knew she was right. The evidence they'd uncovered didn't just implicate past generations. It revealed ongoing crimes that could destroy the current power structure in Ciena Notreal and send several prominent citizens to prison. Too much was at stake for their enemies to risk leaving witnesses, but the confession gave them one advantage. Morrison had been just as paranoid about his partners as they had been about him. He'd prepared evidence caches that even decades of searching hadn't uncovered, and the locations were detailed in coded references throughout his journal. There's a way out of this, Jed said, thinking furiously. But it's going to require a leap of faith. Before Eleanor could ask what he meant, the barn door exploded inward as several men forced their way inside. Coleman led the group, his badge catching the lantern light, but his expression belonging to a criminal rather than a lawman. Well, well, Coleman said, surveying the open safe and scattered documents. Looks like you folks have been having quite the treasure hunt. Harold Sinclair stepped out of the shadows behind Coleman, his expensive clothes out of place in the dusty barn, but his pale eyes blazing with fury. I offered you a chance to leave quietly, Tully. You should have taken it. Like James Whitmore should have taken your offers. Like Tom Whitmore should have minded his own business. Sinclair's face flushed red. Those men brought their fates upon themselves. We gave them every opportunity to be reasonable. You murdered them, Eleanor said, her voice shaking with rage. Just like your family murdered Sarah Morrison, and God knows how many others. Ancient history, Sinclair replied dismissively. Every great fortune is built on someone's bones. The question is whether you're going to add your bones to the foundation or find a way to be useful. Two more men entered the barn, faces Jed recognized from around town, but couldn't quite place. The conspiracy apparently reached deeper into the community than he'd imagined. What we're going to do, Coleman said, is clean up this mess. You're going to hand over every document you found, and then we're going to have a tragic accident. Grieving widower finally succumbs to despair, takes his neighbor with him in a murder-suicide. Very sad, but these things happen. People know we were investigating together, Eleanor said defiantly. Mrs. Fenwick, Cornelius Finch, they'll ask questions. Coleman smiled coldly. Mrs. Fenwick is 80 years old and easily confused about what she might have seen or heard. As for Mr. Finch, he had a terrible fall from his hotel window last night. Apparently, he'd been drinking heavily and lost his balance. The casual mention of another murder sent ice through Jed's veins. These people had been killing to protect their secrets for decades, and they wouldn't hesitate to continue the pattern. "You can't murder everyone who gets close to the truth," he said. "We don't have to murder everyone," Sinclair replied. "Just enough to keep the rest quiet. It's a technique that served our families well for generations." One of the unnamed men stepped forward and began gathering the documents scattered around the safe. Jed watched helplessly as evidence that could expose decades of crime was collected by the very people it could incriminate. But they didn't know about Morrison's confession, which Jed had managed to conceal inside his coat when they were interrupted. The journal contained not just proof of historical crimes, but specific locations where additional evidence could be found, evidence that could destroy the conspiracy. Even if he and Eleanor didn't survive to tell their story, there's something you should know, Jed said, trying to buy time while he figured out how to use Morrison's final insurance policy. "What's that?" Coleman asked. John Morrison left a confession. A complete record of everything that really happened, including who was really in charge and where the bodies are buried. The effect of his words was immediate and dramatic. Sinclair went white as parchment, and Coleman's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. "You're lying," Sinclair said, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "He knew you were planning to kill him," Jed continued. "So he wrote it all down, every murder, every theft, every corrupt deal, and he hid copies in places you'll never find without his instructions. Where is this supposed confession?" Coleman demanded. Jed's hand moved slowly toward his coat pocket, and instantly 3 guns were pointed at him. "Easy," he said. "I'm just reaching for the papers." But instead of producing Morrison's confession, Jed pulled out Martha's wedding ring. The simple gold band caught the lantern light as he held it up for everyone to see. "This belonged to my wife," he said quietly. "She believed in truth, in justice, in standing up for what's right no matter the cost. Before she died, she made me promise that I'd never let fear keep me from doing what I knew was right." Eleanor was staring at him with growing understanding, realizing that he was preparing for something desperate. "She also taught me that some things are worth dying for," Jed continued, slipping the ring back into his pocket. "The question is whether any of you have ever believed in anything worth killing for, or if you're just cowards who inherited someone else's crimes." The insult hit its mark. Sinclair's face darkened with rage, and he stepped forward as if to strike Jed physically. In that moment of distraction, Jed made his move. He lunged not toward escape, but toward the lantern, knocking it over and plunging the barn into darkness. In the chaos that followed, shouts, gunshots, men stumbling over each other, he pressed Morrison's confession into Eleanor's hands. The confession tells where to find Morrison's body and the final evidence cache. He whispered urgently. "Get to the federal marshal in the county seat. Tell them everything." Before Eleanor could protest, rough hands seized her in the darkness. When Coleman finally got another lantern lit, she was gone, spirited away by Sinclair's men, while Jed found himself facing 3 guns and the promise of a reckoning that had been 40 years in the making. The Ciena Notreal. Town Hall had never hosted an emergency meeting quite like this one. Word had spread through the community, with the speed that only genuine crisis could generate, the kind of news that pulled people from their breakfast tables and sent them hurrying through the morning. Streets with expressions of curiosity and dread. Jed sat in the front row, his hands bound behind his back, but his posture defiant despite the circumstances. Sheriff Coleman stood nearby, trying to maintain the appearance of lawful authority while the situation spiraled beyond anyone's control. The morning's events had been set in motion by Eleanor's escape during the barn confrontation, and now the conspiracy's carefully maintained secrecy was crumbling in the harsh light of public scrutiny. Mayor Harrison called for order from the podium, his usually confident demeanor betrayed by the tremor in his voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we've called this emergency session to address certain allegations that have been circulating regarding our town's history and the conduct of some of our most respected families. The hall buzzed with nervous energy. Nearly every resident of Ciena Notreal seemed to be present, cramming into seats and standing along the walls. In the back, Jed could see Mrs. Fenwick clutching her handbag with white knuckles, her elderly eyes sharp with the awareness that something momentous was unfolding. Harold Sinclair rose from his seat among the town council members, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "Mr. Mayor, what we're dealing with here is nothing more than the ravings of a grief-stricken man who's been spreading vicious lies about prominent families in our community. Where's Eleanor Whitmore?" called out a voice from the crowd. Jed recognized Pete Jameson from the Silver Dollar, his saloon keeper's instincts telling him that something didn't smell right about the official story. "Mrs. Whitmore is being questioned regarding her involvement in Mr. Tully's investigation," Coleman answered smoothly. "She's in protective custody for her own safety." The lie was delivered with practiced ease, but Jed could see doubt flickering in several faces throughout the hall. Eleanor's absence was conspicuous, and her reputation for honesty made Coleman's explanation ring false. "What exactly is Mr. Tully accused of?" This question came from Dr. Margaret Foster, one of the few people in town who'd maintained neutrality in the growing conflict. "And why hasn't he been formally charged if he's committed crimes?" Harrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mr. Tully has been making wild accusations about our founding families based on forged documents and fabricated evidence. He's also been associating with known criminals who came to town under false pretenses." "Known criminals?" Dr. Foster pressed. "Are you referring to Mr. Finch, the writer who was asking about local history?" "Mr. Finch was not who he claimed to be," Sinclair interjected. "His real identity remains under investigation, but we have reason to believe he was involved in criminal activities." Jed watched the performance with grim fascination. The conspiracy's members were skilled at manipulation and misdirection, but they were operating under pressure now, forced to improvise rather than execute carefully planned strategies. Then, from the back of the hall, a new voice cut through the political maneuvering like a blade. "Perhaps we should let Mr. Tully speak for himself." Every head turned to see Eleanor Whitmore standing in the doorway, flanked by two men in federal uniforms. She looked tired and disheveled, but her eyes blazed with the fire of someone who'd finally found the courage to confront her demons. "Mrs. Whitmore," Harrison said weakly, "we were told you were in protective custody?" Eleanor's voice carried clearly through the suddenly silent hall. "That's an interesting way to describe being kidnapped at gunpoint." She stepped forward, and Jed could see that she carried a familiar leather satchel. "But I suppose creative storytelling runs in certain families." Coleman's hand moved toward his gun, but one of the federal officers, a tall man with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to dangerous situations, stepped forward. "I'm Marshal William Brady," he announced. "I'm here investigating allegations of corruption, murder, and conspiracy to commit fraud spanning multiple decades." The hall erupted in shocked murmurs and nervous conversations. Several council members exchanged worried glances, while Sinclair's face had gone pale as winter snow. "This is outrageous," Sinclair blustered. "These federal officers have no jurisdiction here, and they certainly have no right to disrupt a legitimate town meeting based on the fantasies of criminals and malcontents." Marshal Brady's smile was thin and professional. "Actually, Mr. Sinclair, we have very specific jurisdiction when it comes to crimes involving territorial land grants and federal banking regulations. And based on the evidence Mrs. Whitmore has provided, we have probable cause to believe such crimes have indeed occurred." Eleanor moved to the front of the hall, her presence commanding attention despite her modest appearance. "What we've discovered," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "is evidence of a conspiracy that has controlled this town through murder and intimidation for more than 40 years. She reached into her satchel. and pulled out what appeared to be a small mechanical device, brass and steel components arranged in an intricate pattern that Jed didn't immediately recognize. This recording device was hidden in the old Deadwood Hollow Bank by John Morrison before his death, Eleanor continued. It contains recorded conversations between Morrison and his partners, including detailed confessions of multiple murders and a complete breakdown of their criminal enterprise. The silence in the hall was so complete that Jed could hear his own heartbeat. Recording devices were rare and expensive in the 1880s, but not unknown to someone with Morrison's resources and paranoia. "That's impossible," Coleman said, but his voice lacked conviction. Recording technology didn't exist in the territory 40 years ago. Edison's phonograph was patented in 1877, Eleanor replied calmly. Morrison acquired one of the early commercial models through contacts in Denver. He was apparently more technologically advanced than his partners gave him credit for. Marshal Brady stepped forward and accepted the device from Eleanor's hands. "This equipment has been examined by federal experts in Denver. The recordings are authentic and contain evidence of multiple federal crimes." Sinclair was on his feet now, his composure finally cracking under the weight of decades' worth of secrets suddenly brought to light. "This is all fabrication. That woman is clearly unstable, seeking revenge for her husband's accidental death by spreading malicious lies about respectable citizens. Tom Whitmore's death wasn't an accident," Eleanor said quietly. "And neither was James Whitmore's death 40 years ago, or Sarah Morrison's death, or any of the other accidents that befell people who got too close to the truth." She turned to address the crowd directly, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority that came from finally speaking truth after years of silence. "My great-aunt Sarah Morrison died trying to expose this conspiracy. My husband Tom died trying to finish what she started. How many more people have to die before we admit that some of our most prominent families built their fortunes on murder and theft?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Around the hall, Jed could see people beginning to process the implications of what they were hearing, the possibility that their community's entire foundation had been built on lies and violence. In the growing tension, Marshal Brady's voice cut through the confusion with official authority. "Based on the evidence presented, I'm placing several individuals under arrest pending federal investigation." As the federal officers moved through the hall, Jed realized that the reckoning he'd unconsciously set in motion by purchasing a rusty safe had finally arrived. The truth that had been buried for decades was about to reshape everything. The people of Ciena Notreal thought they knew. About their home and their history, the attempted arrests quickly devolved into chaos as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Sheriff Coleman drew his weapon, but found himself facing not just federal marshals, but several armed townspeople who'd finally understood the depth of the corruption that had ruled their lives for decades. "Stand down." "Coleman!" Marshal Brady commanded, his own gun drawn with practiced efficiency. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and violation of federal statutes." But Coleman wasn't listening. His eyes had taken on the desperate look of a cornered animal, and he swung his weapon toward Eleanor as if taking a hostage might. "Somehow salvage the situation. Nobody moves or the woman dies," he snarled. The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds before Pete Jameson stepped forward from the crowd, his saloon owner's shotgun leveled at Coleman's head. "I've known Eleanor Whitmore for 20 years, Bill. She's never told a lie in her life. You, on the other hand, have been lying to all of us for longer than I care to think about." Others in the crowd began to speak up, their voices creating a chorus of long-suppressed suspicions and half-remembered inconsistencies. Dr. Foster mentioned questionable deaths that had been ruled accidental. Mrs. Patterson recalled seeing Coleman in suspicious locations at odd hours. Even quiet Mrs. Fenwick found her voice, describing years of subtle pressure to avoid certain historical research. Faced with the community's collective awakening, Coleman slowly lowered his weapon. The federal officers moved in quickly, restraining him with the efficient professionalism of men who'd done this many times before. Harold Sinclair made one last desperate attempt to control the narrative. "Even if some of these allegations are true," he called out, "they concern events from decades ago, ancient history that has no bearing on our current community." Eleanor reached into her satchel once more and withdrew a document that made several people in the crowd gasp with recognition. It was yellowed with age and bore official seals, but the writing was still clearly legible. "This is the original town charter for Ciena Notreal," she announced, holding the document up for everyone to see. The legitimate charter, filed with territorial authorities in 1875. Jed could see confusion rippling through the crowd. Most people had probably never thought much about their town's founding documents, but something in Eleanor's tone suggested this revelation was significant. "According to this charter," Eleanor continued, "Ciena Notreal was originally incorporated by 5 homesteaders, including my husband's grandfather, James Whitmore, and several other families who were later driven out or killed." She turned to face Sinclair directly. "Your family isn't mentioned anywhere in the legitimate founding documents, Harold. Neither are the Harrisons or any of the other families who've claimed to be our town's original founders." The implications struck the crowd like a physical blow. Marshal Brady stepped forward to examine the charter, his expression growing grimmer as he read. "What Mrs. Whitmore is saying," the marshal explained to the confused townspeople, "is that your current town government is based on fraudulent documentation. The real founders were murdered or driven away, and their legal claim to governance was usurped by the criminal conspiracy. Mayor Harrison tried to maintain his dignity even as federal officers moved to arrest him. This is preposterous. Our family has served this community faithfully for generations." "Your family has stolen from this community for generations," Eleanor replied firmly. "And you've murdered anyone who threatened to expose the theft." She pulled out Morrison's detailed map and confession, spreading them on a nearby table for everyone to see. John Morrison documented everything, every murder, every fraudulent land transfer, every act of corruption. He even drew maps showing where he hid evidence of the crimes. The confession's most damning revelation came in its final pages, where Morrison had detailed the conspiracy's plan to continue operating across generations. Each family involved would pass down not just wealth, but specific criminal responsibilities, ensuring that the network of corruption would survive indefinitely. "The reason Tom was killed," Eleanor explained, her voice breaking slightly, "is that he'd found Morrison's original evidence cache and was preparing to expose the ongoing nature of the conspiracy. It wasn't just historical crimes, it was active, continuing criminal enterprise." As federal officers began systematically arresting the conspiracy's members, the true scope of the corruption became clear. Nearly half the town council was involved, along with several prominent businessmen and even the bank. President who'd been pressing Jed about his mortgage, the payments. But the most shocking arrest came when Marshal Brady approached. Mrs. Fenwick with apologetic professionalism. "Ma'am, I'm afraid you're under arrest as well." The elderly librarian's shoulders sagged with what appeared to be relief rather than surprise. "I wondered when this day would come," she said quietly. 40 years is a long time to keep secrets." The crowd stared in stunned silence as the woman they'd all trusted with their children's education and their community's historical records was led away in restraints. Mrs. Fenwick was the conspiracy's intelligence coordinator, Eleanor explained sadly. She monitored anyone who got too interested in local history and made sure that damaging information disappeared from the library's collection. Dr. Foster spoke for many when she asked, "How deep does this go? Who can we trust?" Marshal Brady consulted his notes before answering. "Based on the evidence we've recovered, approximately 30% of your current community leadership was actively involved in the conspiracy. Many others were simply intimidated into silence or compliance. As the arrests continued and the full truth began to emerge, Jed found himself thinking about the weight of secrets and the courage required to speak truth in the face of powerful opposition. Martha would have been proud of Eleanor's strength and proud of the community's willingness to face uncomfortable realities rather than continue living with comfortable lies. The rusty safe that had seemed like such a foolish purchase had become the key that unlocked decades of carefully hidden truth. Sometimes, Jed reflected, the most valuable treasures were the ones nobody else wanted to claim. Outside the town hall, federal wagons were loading prisoners for transport to Denver, where they would face justice in courts that couldn't be bought or intimidated. The conspiracy that had ruled Ciena Notreal for 40 years was finally coming to an end, but the work of rebuilding a community's trust and integrity was just beginning. 6 months after the trials ended in Denver, Jed Tully found himself standing in the bright afternoon sunlight outside a gleaming new building that bore a simple brass plaque, the Ciena Notreal Historical Society and Museum. The modest structure had been built with funds recovered from the conspiracy's assets, and it represented something the town had never possessed before, an honest accounting of its own past. Eleanor emerged from the building carrying a set of keys, her face bearing the kind of satisfaction that came from meaningful work completed. She'd been elected as the museum's first director by unanimous vote, a position that seemed perfectly suited to someone who dedicated her life to preserving truth rather than convenient fiction. "Everything's ready," she said, joining him on the steps. "All the documents are properly catalogued and preserved. Future generations will know the real story of how this community came to be." Through the museum's large windows, Jed could see the centerpiece of the main exhibit, a modern safe, considerably larger and more sophisticated than the rusty vault that had started everything. This new safe would protect the historical documents and evidence that told the complete story of Ciena Notreal's founding, ensuring that the truth would never again be lost to time or deliberate concealment. The safe's contents included not just Morrison's confession and the recovered documents, but new research that filled in gaps the conspiracy had tried to erase. They'd found the legitimate homesteader's original settlement agreements, Sarah Morrison's hidden correspondence, and even the location of John Morrison's remains, exactly where his confession had indicated they would be. Hard to believe it all started with trading buck for that old safe, Jed mused, thinking of the horse he'd lost and the treasure he'd gained. Maybe it started before that, Eleanor suggested gently. Maybe it started when you decided you needed something to hope for, something to fill the emptiness Martha's death had left behind. The past 6 months had brought changes neither of them could have anticipated. The federal trials had resulted in convictions for conspiracy, murder, and fraud, stretching back decades. Several prominent families had seen their wealth confiscated and their members imprisoned, while the community struggled to rebuild its identity around truth rather than mythology. But healing had come along with justice. Property stolen through fraud had been returned to the descendants of its rightful owners. Eleanor had recovered not just her family's original homestead, but clear title to land that had been in the Whitmore family for generations. Other families had received similar restitution, along with formal acknowledgement of the injustices their ancestors had suffered. Jed's own situation had improved dramatically. A grateful community had insisted on compensating him for his role in exposing the conspiracy, and the federal government had provided rewards for recovery of stolen property. His financial problems were resolved, his ranch was secure, and he'd found a new purpose as the museum's senior researcher and archivist. More importantly, he'd found Eleanor. Their partnership in pursuing justice had evolved naturally into something deeper and more personal. They'd been married 3 weeks ago in a simple ceremony at the new community church, with half the town in attendance and Martha's wedding ring serving as Eleanor's temporary band until they could travel to Denver for proper rings. Mrs. Fenwick would have hated this, Eleanor said, gesturing toward the museum. All those secrets she worked so hard to keep, displayed for anyone to read, The elderly librarian had received a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperating with federal investigators, but she died in prison before serving half her term. Her final act had been to provide detailed information about which historical documents had been destroyed or hidden over the years, helping researchers reconstruct the complete timeline of the conspiracy's operations. "She made her choices," Jed replied, "just like we all did." They walked slowly around the building, checking that everything was ready for tomorrow's official opening. The museum represented more than just historical preservation. It was a symbol of the community's commitment to honest self-examination and transparent governance. The new town council, elected after the mass arrests, had instituted policies requiring public access to all government records and community oversight of official decisions. Sheriff Coleman's replacement had been recruited from outside the region, specifically to ensure independence from local political influence. Even the bank had been restructured under federal oversight to prevent the kind of financial manipulation that had sustained the conspiracy for decades. As they completed their circuit of the building, Jed noticed a familiar figure approaching from the street. Pete Jameson raised his hand in greeting, carrying what appeared to be a bottle wrapped in brown paper. "Thought you folks might want to toast the museum's completion," Pete called out. "Got some of the good stuff from Denver. None of that local rotgut we've been serving at the Silver Dollar." They sat on the museum steps as the sun began to set behind the mountains, sharing whiskey and reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Pete had emerged as one of the community's most vocal advocates for reform, using his saloon as an informal meeting place where people could discuss the changes openly and honestly. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Pete said, studying the amber liquid in his glass. "All those years we accepted things that didn't quite make sense. People dying in convenient accidents, families suddenly leaving town without explanation, records disappearing from the library. We told ourselves it was just bad luck or coincidence. People see what they want to see," Eleanor observed, "and they avoid seeing what might require them to take difficult action." "Martha used to say that courage wasn't about not being afraid," Jed added. "It was about doing what was right despite being afraid." As darkness fell over the valley, lanterns began glowing in windows throughout the town. The community looked much the same as it had 6 months ago, but everything fundamental had changed. The fear that had hung over Ciena Notreal like an invisible cloud had lifted, replaced by the kind of honest relationships that could only grow in the light of truth. "What do you think happens next?" Pete asked. Jed looked at Eleanor, seeing in her eyes the same sense of possibility that had first drawn him to that rusty safe at the Deadwood Hollow auction. They'd learned that even the darkest secrets could be brought to light by ordinary people, willing to ask difficult questions and pursue uncomfortable answers. "We keep telling the truth," Eleanor said simply. "We make sure the next generation knows the real story, not just the convenient version. And we remember that democracy only works when people have the courage to hold their leaders accountable." As they prepared to lock up the museum for the night, Jed took one final look at the new safe that would protect their community's true history. Unlike the rusty vault that had hidden shameful secrets, this safe would preserve evidence of courage, justice, and the power of ordinary people to overcome extraordinary corruption. Tomorrow, when the museum opened its doors to the public, children would learn the real story of their town's founding. They would understand that heroes weren't always the people with statues in the town square, but sometimes were quiet individuals like Sarah Morrison and Tom Whitmore, who'd been willing to sacrifice everything for truth. Walking home through the peaceful streets with Eleanor at his side, Jed reflected on the wisdom Martha had tried to teach him about carrying grief without being drowned by it. The pain of losing her would always be part of him, but it no longer defined him. Instead, her memory had become a source of strength that had enabled him to honor her values when it mattered most. The rusty safe that had seemed like such a foolish purchase had given him exactly what he'd needed without knowing it, a reason to hope, a purpose worth pursuing, and ultimately a future worth building. Sometimes the most valuable treasures really were the ones nobody else wanted to claim.